I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word.
The clip you're about to watch is a fascinating conversation between William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro. They're discussing Christianity, they're discussing Judaism, they're discussing some of the differences between the two. And in this particular clip that I'm about to play, it gets really interesting because it gets down to the idea of atonement. I want to point something out, so check it out. Let's dive in. Here it is.
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God, and I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true, and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelation.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number 3 would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. That the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these 3 facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because, and here I'm going to merge the two in terms of the idea of God personally speaking to people and giving them the morality of the Old Testament, which largely is reflected in the New Testament. And the New Testament is part of the Old Testament, according to Christians anyway. It reflects the chief morality of the Old Testament. It doesn't supplant it entirely. The Old Testament doesn't become a nothing just because the New Testament comes around. So that's why I'm now moving back toward the kind of theological question, which is, what's the purpose of the revelation? Meaning, would it be sufficient to work within the framework of the first half of our conversation with regard to sort of rational pushes not toward revelation and the presence of God in human form in Christianity, or the presence of God on top of a mountain in Judaism? Would a God of reason alone be sufficient? Or do you need to have, for what purpose do you need to have a God who is speaking directly to people at Sinai or speaking through Jesus in Christianity?
I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word: atonement. What is needed is atonement for sin. And in the Levitical sacrifices, in the tabernacle and later in the temple, you had a sacrificial system whereby atonement was made for sin through the sacrifice of various animals. And Jesus himself and the authors of the New Testament think of Jesus as being the ultimate sacrificial offering to God to make atonement once and for all for the sins of mankind, so that in his sacrificial death on the cross, he fulfills all of these Jewish antecedents or foreshadowing of a decisive atonement for sin that will reconcile us to God and bring forgiveness and pardon and cleansing.
So you've debated a bevy of atheists and agnostics on a variety of topics. Which was the debate that you felt was most challenging for you?
So do you notice how right here, when it gets to the crux of the matter, the atonement itself, there's just a dodge. It's like, let's talk about the next topic. Let's talk about, have you ever, let's go on to talking about the debate rather than actually engaging with that idea of atonement. And I do think that that's rather telling in terms of Ben's willingness to address that unique feature of what Jesus did on the cross, the atonement for the sins of the world. That's actually what's at stake here. That's actually the claim. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This, of course, harkens back to Genesis 3:15, where it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. This is a prophecy of the cross going all the way back to the time of the fall. It's all there. It's all littered throughout the Old Testament, but you can just see the hesitancy of engaging with that idea of atonement and what it means. It's not just Yom Kippur. We're talking about one time, once for all, Christ died so that all might live. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son does not have life. The only way to the Father is through the Son. He's the way, the truth, and the life. If it's really true that God himself put on flesh and walked amongst us, that the Word became flesh, and then he lived the perfect life that we couldn't live, died the death that we deserved to die, defeated death in his resurrection, and offers us through that life everlasting, that's the best possible news that exists for humanity in light of the kind of people that we really are, in light of the wars that we've committed, the personal tragedies that we have all undertaken in our lives, the inclinations that we have toward addiction, toward depression, toward anxiety. If you really look at the state of man, if you really look at human nature, this is the best possible news for us, that our Creator has found a way to solve our deepest problem, which is our fallenness, and has offered that solution in himself on the cross for us, giving us the possibility of being with him in eternal joy forever. That is what the atonement is about. And so it is a little bit frustrating to see Ben just kind of dodge it and go on to the debate thing. All that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then stick around. There's going to be a lot more here at Daily Dose of Wisdom, where we're going to be looking at specific clips, giving a little commentary, and I hope you guys enjoy. So have a good day. Bye.